Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says government is trying to instill confidence in discouraged job seekers. But even if government manages to turn our economic situation around, more retrenchments are expected in the short term. 2.2 million people, remember, lost their jobs in the second quarter of this year as the COVID-19 lockdown battered businesses. The SABC has followed in the footsteps of many private media companies and is busy with a retrenchment process. An African bank is the first to announce job cuts among the banks. To discuss, we're now joined by employment law specialist Fatima Salijee, who is the MD of SGV Inc. and Aequitas Consultants. Ms. Salijee, thank you for being with us. We're hearing more and more about Section 189, and unfortunately it will touch more and more lives in this country. Give us an overview of the law here of Section 189. What sort of rights does it give to employers, and what rights do employees have?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the show. Section 189 is a process that is prescribed by the Labour Relations Act, and in short, it is a process of consultation that is required for the parties to engage with each other in a meaningful joint consensus-seeking process. The most important thing about going into the consultations is that the employer must go in bona fide, meaning that there must not have been a decision made to retrench prior to entering into the consultation process. So insofar as the rights of the employer is concerned, the employer obviously has the right to retrench employees, subject to the provisos that they have followed a procedurally fair process and that there is a proper substance, meaning a rationale, an operational rationale to the retrenchments. Employees have the right to be consulted, not necessarily individually, but they have the right to be consulted. They have the right to information. They have the right to fully engage with the employer. They have the right to make proposals and provide alternatives to dismissals, and for those alternatives to be considered, and for the employer to respond to those suggestions that the employees make. The employees are also entitled to severance pay ultimately if retrenchments cannot be avoided.
All right, we'll get to that, but this period of consultations, you say, is required and is important. Looking at the SABC, for example, the employer says it's gone above and beyond what was required. Workers say they haven't taken the process seriously. I mean, how do you assess whether those consultations were meaningful and assess the motives going into those consultations?
Ultimately, what will happen is if the matter is challenged, there will be a very stringent scrutiny in terms of what had happened during the consultation process and whether the employer had genuinely consulted with the employees in an effort to ultimately avoid or minimize the retrenchments. Now, the fact that you can have many consultations doesn't necessarily mean that you have set out to achieve what the legislation wants to achieve. So it's always going to be substance over form. There are no maximum number of consultations that is prescribed by legislation. It's ultimately circumstance dependent and how the parties are engaging with each other, the bona fides, and that will be scrutinized and determined on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. And under COVID-19, surely there's a lot of virtual consultation. Is that acceptable?
The courts have pronounced on that, and indeed it is an acceptable means of consultation.
So if you get a Section 189 letter yourself, sometimes you're presented with options, voluntary retrenchment, reapplying for your position. Do you have any advice? And you said that there was some entitlement to severance pay. I mean, what about the conditions we're in right now with many companies saying they just don't have any money?
So when you are faced with alternatives to retrenchment, the first thing is to obviously apply your mind very carefully. And why I say this is because if an employee unjustifiably or unreasonably declines an alternative to retrenchment, you could be waiving your right to severance pay. Now, this is ultimately a test. I mean, one will look at the reasonableness of the offer versus the reasonableness of the refusal. So that is the first thing. An employee must carefully consider any rejection prior to rejecting the offer. And insofar as severance pay is concerned, I mean, if the employer ultimately cannot afford to pay, then they would have to consider something like business rescue, because severance pay is a prescribed right by law in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Labour Relations Act.
Yeah.
So there's no moving away from that.
And that's a certain amount of pay based on the period that you have worked, basically.
Correct. I mean, that's the minimum amount, which is 1 week per year of service over and above your other prescribed payments. But sometimes you have collective agreements or policies or practices where severance pay is more lucrative than the one week per year of service.
Can a Section 189 be used to change the terms of your employment? So your salary, working hours, even though you're doing the exact same job?
The short answer is yes. We call this in law a matter of mutual interest, of a demand when you'd want to change somebody's terms and conditions of employment. And ordinarily that would be known as a unilateral change to terms and conditions of employment. But where that request is based on a valid operational requirement, then it is allowed in law. And ultimately what the courts will look at is what was the dominant reason for the dismissal. Was it the refusal to accede to a demand, or was it a genuine operational requirement?
Yeah. My final question to you in all of this, how much power does an individual worker have? Say you believe you've been treated unfairly, you've been caught up in a process. We know after COVID-19, many workplaces brought people back, but at lower salaries, etc. Do you have that power as an individual to fight, to check on your rights, and to challenge very big employers?
You most certainly do, because what has happened, unfortunately, is that a lot of employers, whilst attempting, in good faith to try and avoid layoffs, what they have done is they've applied salary cuts across the board without negotiating. And unfortunately, that is not accepted by the law. So if that has happened to you, then you do have the right to refer a dispute regarding a unilateral change to terms and conditions of employment to the relevant bargaining council or the CCMA in order to ensure that your rights are intact.
All right, we appreciate your time tonight. That was employment law specialist Fatima Salijee, and unfortunately, this does affect many South Africans at the moment. We've already seen incredible job losses earlier in the